This is Module 2, Lecture 3 for KNH 214 Global Wellbeing. There's going to be a little overlap with Lecture 2 from this module, just because I think I rushed through a little bit of Lecture 2 to the end. I couldn't quite finish. So there will be overlap. This lecture will solely focus on institutions and well-being. So you can kind of go back in. I'm really just going to focus in on all the institutions that are included in this course, but I wasn't able to finish the last couple of slides in Lecture 2. So again, an institution is an obligatory form of getting by and getting along in a pre-established social setting. So it's our society, basically, a system of social control. There's norms and rules. You've experienced these. Certainly, I just focus on, for example, I was raised Catholic, Polish Roman Catholic, and we had to attend Mass on Sunday, and I was the infamous altar boy growing up, lots of rules and so forth with most forms of religion. I'm not saying that's good or bad per se, but certainly that's an example of an institution. And the reason we're including this with well-being is because we don't just become who we are in a social vacuum, right? I mean, there has to be things that impact us in a variety of ways and shape who we are. So they control human conduct by setting up a predefined patterns of conduct. You know, you go to school every day. That's an expectation within the institution of education. There's some degree of conformity. Institutions place some degree of constraint on your behavior. In other words, if you miss school, you're considered delinquent. If you rob someone, according to our legal system, you can be tried and go to prison. Some effects of an institution you're aware of, some you may not be. So some of these rules and so forth hit you over the face, hit you over the head, slap you in the face, and some are a little more subtle throughout our lives in terms of we may not always be aware that these institutions are impacting our welfare, our well-being. Lots of examples of institutions, political, economic, all the way through business and industry. The Greek system, which is a pretty powerful institution here at Miami, that would be probably considered a sub-institution within education. Do institutions foster or impede our well-being? That's a question I'd like you to keep asking yourself. And don't just say, oh yeah, they've impacted my well-being in a very positive way. So I want you to just kind of make sure you dig below the surface when you get into some learning activities. One is the learning activity with Vasanti, the Indian woman that Nussbaum highlights. And then one of your connective reflective papers is all about how certain institutions may have positively or negatively impacted your well-being. And the place to go back in terms of how this has come about over hundreds of years, Rousseau wrote about institutions in the Social Compact, which is a very famous piece, which you can find it online. I found it. It's pretty fascinating in terms of how he sets up this relationship between the self or the individual and society. And he starts with, in order to live in society. Right, so we have to give up some freedom in order to be protected and so forth. So pretty interesting, I think, in terms of how institutions may impact well-being. Education, it's an institution we spend a lot of time in. It's massive. You got to be a little bit careful with education because it's really kind of designed to reproduce social order. There's not a lot of equity in education. Some of us have been very lucky. For example, I teach at a school, Miami University. Many of you probably, some of you at least, went to private schools. Some of you went to more wealthy public schools than others. So there's vast differential in terms of financial support depending on the school system you're in. And schools are formal organizations. They've got hierarchies. They can be impersonal. The idea is to graduate. So just an example of one institution. The question is, do they enhance our well-being? That's a tricky question, so think about it a little bit. There's a professor here, Dr. Wang, who I've gotten to know a little bit over the last year or so. He's written a book called The Hybrid Tiger. And he has really examined the institutional of education as it relates to China and the U.S. Very, very interesting in terms of why the educational systems exist in China and the U.S. I've written about the education institution in reading number 15. I've done some work in well-being with some grants in the high schools. And my experience is that schools limit well-being enhancement. You can argue with me. You can read my article if you want, but it was hard work because they're focused mostly on getting kids through. And I don't want to be too cynical, but that's been my experience. So anyway, there's a couple good videos on this. Ken Robinson, who's an educational consultant, and Sugata Mitra, who's a professor at Harvard, maybe, where he's done some very interesting work with technology and learning in other countries. Fascinating stuff. So you can find that on TED Talks, Robinson and Mitra. Family, another institution. Family is the oldest universal social institution. In the old days, extended families were the norm. In other words, grandparents living with parents and children and grandchildren. They're more nuclear now in terms of just parents and children typically living together. There's different kinds of family types in terms of orientation, procreation, symmetrical. And basically, fewer people live in families traditionally defined. We have much more diversity now than we did 50 to 60 years ago in terms of single parents, for example, gay parents. And this relates to religion a little bit, which we'll get into in a minute. Parents typically report less happiness than non-parent families, so be forewarned. If you get married and have children, you won't be happier. It's challenging to have children. They can enhance your life in many ways, but the data shows that it doesn't enhance happiness. So anyway, family used to be the primary influencer back in the agricultural days, but now, because of suburbia and urbanization, other institutions have taken over a little bit this role. So this is an area of transition in our society right now in terms of who kind of is the primary influencer of children's development and well-being. And then just a little forewarning, children love their parents and want to please them, so it's very difficult for children, adolescents, and emerging adults, such as yourself, to view parents as limiting their well-being. So you typically want to view parents as helping enhance your well-being, but at some point, for some of us, you're going to have to go against the wishes of your parents if you want to become yourself, and that's tricky. There's a very interesting video through a Wall Street Journal article, young children on their own in China, parents leaving them to go to the city to earn money, and how children are kind of raising themselves and educating themselves. Very interesting, kind of a different take on how families operate in other countries. It's certainly in rural China. Religion and well-being, religion's common elements, sacred and rituals. And that's the attraction for people, are those ideas, or those common elements of religion. Religion is more institutionalized than spirituality. Spirituality typically can be separated from religion. Not everyone buys this, but that's kind of how the literature kind of plays itself out. And I think there's a reading number 16 gets into some of these ideas of religion and spirituality as it relates to well-being. Now, religion can be powerful because it kind of separates the sacred from the profane. So in our normal humdrum of everyday life, religion can kind of put us to another place. We get to interact with others of like-mindedness in terms of a community, right? What they might call a collective ecstasy. So religion and spirituality can influence positive well-being, and just one caution. If you approach religion in an extrinsic way, in other words, outside of yourself, like for things like security or comfort or status or social support, typically people do not get enhanced well-being when they approach religion from an extrinsic perspective. So something to really think about in terms of why, if you have a religious orientation, why do you have that orientation? And that will impact your well-being in terms of how that plays out. And then to end, in terms of some other major institutions, these are really biggies, but very complex in terms of political, legal, and economic institutions. They all impact well-being. Now, the literature kind of suggests, some of the recent writings, that we're in basically a consumer culture. So in a consumer culture, it's driven by business and industry, And these companies want us to buy, and they want us to buy, and they want to buy happiness. Look at any of the commercials. They try to connect happiness with opening a bottle of Coke. They try to connect happiness with buying a certain kind of car. The readings throughout this course try to warn us that this doesn't work for sustainable well-being. It just makes us buy more stuff. The pursuit of happiness. So you can go into readings 10 and number 2 and number 10. Reading 19 gets into this in terms of some of the political aspects of well-being. But ultimately, so good government, good governance, and effective rule of law are linked to greater life satisfaction. So we can't rule out the importance of government. We can't rule out the importance of law or our legal system in terms of impacting our well-being. People won't necessarily have optimal well-being, but you won't have positive well-being unless you have a fair and efficient legal system. Now, democracy can enhance well-being, but only when a country has reached some level of economic development. So if you have go in and create a democracy, but people are poor, that's not going to enhance well-being. So that's why economic development can't be separated from the political system. So pay attention when you're in political science. There's some merit to it. So economic measures such as gross national product, or GDP, or GNP as they call it, doesn't seem to positively impact well-being. And the country of Bhutan has created what they call a gross national happiness index. It's very interesting. It's in reading number 21. So GDP does not equal quality of life or well-being. So for years we thought economic development is all we needed in order to enhance the lives of people. We're beginning to see that that's a fallacy, that that's a myth. And there's definitely some information and data in these readings to kind of support that. Now, however, it's not so cut and dry. The Deaton study in reading number 20 did show that national income was connected to life satisfaction, and it may be that as the world gets smaller due to globalization of information, people are more aware of how rich and poor they are, and that influences how satisfied they are with their lives. So more and more people are knowing what's going on around in the world, and they're starting to compare themselves to people outside of their own little life area. That can be when economics kicks in and does impact their well-being. Now, interestingly, in that study, which is something I'd like you to think a little bit about, is the effect of life expectancy had no apparent effect on life satisfaction. So that's kind of interesting. And satisfaction with health was not related to life expectancy. You would think that it would be. So I'd like you to think about when you get into that reading and prepare for the quiz, why might that be the case? Why might life expectancy have no apparent effect on life satisfaction, right? So think about the Matsugenga, how long you live related to perhaps your physical health, not really connected to well-being, right? And then satisfaction with health not related to life expectancy. So there's some interesting things going on in the world with well-being. Getting near the end here. As I concluded in lecture 2, this was just kind of a slower version of some of that. Your well-being is more likely to change than your level of happiness. So focusing on level 3 seems to make some sense in terms of focusing on levels 1 and 2, which seem to be somewhat consistent over time. Feel underlies eudaimonic well-being. This was back from earlier in lecture 2. And then we ended more of this lecture on the idea of institutions. And I really just want you to think about an understanding of what these institutions are, such as family and religion and politics and our legal system. Those are all institutions, and they can either have a positive or negative impact on our well-being. And I'd like you to think about in your own life, what has been the role of institutions, positively or negatively impacting your well-being. And that ends the section on your well-being in comparison to people elsewhere.